Hello, welcome to another CleaveTech tech tip. Now, if you've been following my series on controllers and all the modifications we've been making to them, you'll realise that today is the one you've all been waiting for. Well, I've got some components in front of me here, and it's time to add some anti-brake. So, in case you didn't know, what is anti-brake? Well, when you normally brake with your slot car, there are two options that normally happen. One option is that the wiper comes back onto the brake band and we've got a brake contact here. And that in effect short circuits the motor so that all that energy that's in the coils of your DC motor gets fed back through the motor in reverse and brakes your motor really fast. So that's what we call sort of normal dynamic braking. The other option is that some people disable their brakes, so they have no brakes at all, so that when you do actually brake, there's no power going to the car, but there's no short circuit either. That's what we call zero brakes. But then sometimes that's not even enough because the motor itself stops so quickly, even with zero brakes, that it makes it really hard to get your car to roll around corners. So that's why we need anti-brake. And there's some various options with anti-brake, but we're going to look at the simplest thing that you can do to generate anti-brake on your basic electronic controller. So now you know what anti-brake is, you can see it's not very difficult to fit to the controller. There's not many components in front of me. It probably takes longer working out where all the components are actually going to be mounted on your controller than it does to actually make the modification to the circuit. In the case of this controller, I'm not going to do anything inside this box. I'm going to mount all the anti-brake stuff up on the hand controller up here because it's mostly connected to this control board up here. All the anti-brake additions will be added here and then they'll go back down through this red wire here down to the main box of the controller, and then the brake switch that's on the controller will work as normal. So let's take a closer look at some of the components that I've got. I've got a little bit of strip board here that I've drilled a hole in, and I've ground away the copper strips on this side of the board, and this is just printed white strips on that side. I've also drilled a hole in it that is large enough to take the switch that I'm going to be using. And the reason why I've ground away the copper strip on the back is so that when the switch sits on the board like that, it doesn't short any of the copper strips. I've also got this switch. This is a similar switch to what I used in a previous video. It's a 3-position switch, an on-off on. So it has one position there, it has a center position, and it has another position there. These are little screws, nuts and washers for the switch. I also have a very small potentiometer here, a finger turn potentiometer. So you can adjust that with your fingers one way or the other. It's very similar to the one that's on the board here. It's just a different value. This one's a 500 ohm finger turn pot. And then I have a simple 1/4 watt fixed resistor. You can probably use a resistor that's a lot smaller than this in terms of wattage, but I had this one available to me. I think this one is around about 68 ohms. It's blue, grey, black, gold, which I think is 68 ohms. And that should be fine for this application, and I'll explain why later. So I'm going to be mounting my switch and my piece of strip board up here on the controller, and you can see that I've already made a little hole on the frame of the controller that's large enough to fit the switch, and the variable's going to go underneath like that, the strip board, and the switch is going to obviously sit there and hold them both together. But I do need to trim out a bit of this wiper board first. You can see there's nothing actually behind it on that bit of board there, so I'm going to undo these two nuts, trim that bit of board away and mount my switch.
A few moments later.
Right, so that's the circuit board fitted and the switch fitted. You can see that just to give me a little bit of clearance from this little mount here where the wiper board mounts to, I've just bent the switch contacts just over a little bit at an angle, and then that gives me the clearance from this. I couldn't really move my switch any further over because otherwise it would be overhanging the edge of the aluminium frame. So that was about where the best place that I could get my switch to sit. Now you can see that I've left enough board that stick out here for my potentiometer to sit in, and I'm going to be soldering my potentiometer in underneath. It's actually got to go round that way. So the reason why I would put it that way round is because when you're holding your controller in your right hand, which this person's controller, they are right-handed, they're going to be adjusting the anti-brakes. So this potentiometer here adjusts your amount of anti-brakes that you get. They're going to adjust it probably with their left hand. So they're going to go from that position and rotate it round to that position there, and that can be your minimum and maximum anti-brakes. And it's just easier to do it that way than if I were to flip it the other way. So let's say it's sat around that way, then you can see that the dial just moves sort of, it's not quite intuitive enough. You know, it sort of moves in the opposite direction to the direction you'd normally expect it to move. So I think that the potentiometer has to be mounted in that way to make it make a bit more sense that it runs around the top of the direction where you're holding it rather than runs around the bottom of the direction that you're holding it. Now just before I soldered it in, you can see that I've broken the track just there. I've deliberately removed the copper track in between these two legs on the potentiometer, here and here, so that they're not joined. Because when you look at your potentiometer on a symbol, you'll notice it's like a resistor, and then it has a little bit that comes off of the middle of the resistor in effect that you adjust. And that's what gives you your adjustment or your variable resistance that you can get from your potentiometer. I'll put a symbol on the screen if you haven't seen it already, and then you can see what I mean. This pin here is one end of the resistor. This pin here is the other end of the resistor. And this little middle pin here, it comes out from the middle of the resistor and slides along in effect, or moves along the resistor, and gives you your adjustable resistance.
12 seconds later.
So there we have it, potentiometer soldered onto the board. Notice it says 501 on it. That means it's 50 with 10, which makes 500 ohms in total. So far I haven't actually done any circuitry. All I've done is mounted a switch, mounted a bit of a circuit board, and I've soldered a potentiometer for adjusting my anti-brakes. Haven't actually done any circuitry. That's because there isn't actually a lot of circuitry involved in doing this. I do need to add this extra resistor though. Now this resistor is going to go between one end of the potentiometer and one side of the switch. So I'm going to solder that on now.
A little longer than a few minutes later.
So I'm back, having soldered this resistor in here. My 68 ohm resistor between the end of the potentiometer here. One end of the potentiometer comes round here and goes to one side of the switch. So this side of the switch here will be connected when the switch is switched into this position. So the middle will be connected to the end of that resistor when the switch is in this position here. So now that I've got that in place, it's time now to disturb some of the circuitry of the controller and actually connect in the part that's going to make the anti-brakes. So what's the basic principle of doing anti-brakes? Well, as I explained earlier in the video, the point is to keep your car rolling round a corner for it not to actually slow down too much. So the principle we're going to employ with this anti-brake circuit is we're actually going to keep the transistor in the box turned on even when you're braking. So that there is a small amount of power going to the car, maybe sometimes not enough to actually drive the car, but enough power to stop the car from actually slowing all the way down. Now, depending on the adjustment of this and the type of motor that you've got, you can actually make it so that the car will move even when you're on the brakes. And that sometimes is necessary for the amount of anti-brake that you need with some motors. Now, in order to make the car move or to make sure there's power at the transistor even when you're braking, I need the ability to be able to disconnect these two brake contacts from the brake wire itself. So I'm going to start by desoldering this red wire here and this red loopy wire that comes around there. I'm going to desolder it from the brake contact, and I'm also going to desolder the wire. You can see this circuit board here runs all the way up to where it says B there. So I'm also going to remove that red wire from the back of the circuit board as well.
12 seconds later.
So I've removed the red brake wire from the brake contact, and I've also removed the loop that went back onto this circuit board here where the wiper touched the brake contact. So I removed both of those, and this is the principle of this anti-brake circuit. What I'm going to be doing is this switch allows me 3 different positions of brakes. It allows me in this position, it's going to be ordinary brakes, which is what we had before, which is what I described in a previous video. So when the switch is in this position, it's actually going to connect this red wire here to the brake contact there and the brake contact here on the frame. In the middle position, it's going to connect this red wire here, which is the brake wire from the controller. It's going to connect it to nothing. So these contacts here and here are going to be connected to nothing, not to this red brake wire here at all. And then in the third position, the two contacts, the brake contact here and the brake contact here, are actually going to be connected to the very first wiper band here, but via a resistor in between. So it's like continuing your resistor bands here around your controller and just literally adding a much lower first band. So that very much lower value first band will actually add power to your transistor and keep your car moving slightly when you brake. So with that in mind, I have to connect the brake contact here on the trigger when the trigger comes back and the brake contact on the circuit board. I have to connect both of those to the middle of the switch, because the switch, remember, is either connecting the middle to nothing, which would be 0 brakes, or it's connecting it to the red wire, the big red wire, which is going to be full brakes, or it's going to be connecting it to the resistor, the potentiometer, and then I'm going to have another wire here that comes back to the first band here, so that it's a continuation of the resistor bands on my wiper board.
12 seconds later.
So I'm back. You can see I've flipped around this contact here so that the red wire can come run right up there into the middle of the switch. And I've even managed to use the same bit of red wire. I just chopped it a little bit shorter because obviously it didn't have to loop all the way around here anymore. So I've chopped it a bit shorter and I've used the other end here that's all ready to solder to the back of the circuit board onto this empty connection here, which will then also connect to this part here. Now, before I put this circuit board back and make this connection up here, I need to do a couple more wires. I need to connect this red wire here, which was the original high power brake wire. I need to connect that all the way around here up to this side of the switch. And I also need to take the end of my potentiometer here and join it to the middle there, and then bring a wire all the way around so that I can actually connect it to this first band on the controller. So I'm going to be soldering it to the back of this very first resistor here on our lowest band of our resistor network or our wiper board.
12 seconds later.
Here we go. So I've got this red wire here running all the way down there. I've extended the other red wire here, put up a little bit of red heat shrink on it to cover it all up. So that's my main red brake wire that comes from the plug. Goes to this side of the switch here. And then you can see on my potentiometer here, I've joined one end of the potentiometer to the center there, and then it comes all the way out here to this black wire here that's ready to solder on to my very first resistor band just there.
Much later.
So the wiper board's screwed back in place. All the wires are connected. So I've got my little black wire running around there that hooks in down and solders onto that very first wiper band. Comes all the way up to here. I've also soldered on the little red wire that goes back to the brake band on the wiper board as well. So one of those two middle sort of orangey reddy wires that go back there, and tucked all the wires nicely inside. And then you can see also that there's no sort of dangly wires sticking out. This bit fits on quite nicely. The circuit board's trimmed around there. Nothing's contacting. It's a little bit close there, but it definitely doesn't contact the nut. It's definitely clear. The wiper moves nice and smoothly. There's no scraping. So I think I'm ready to test. So I've got the switch on the controller in normal brake mode. The switch on the box is in full brakes, and this is what we get in this mode. If I hold the car against the plug. So listen to how quickly it stops. Now if I switch this switch into no brakes, let's see. We get slightly more run on. The car doesn't stop so fast. Compare that to full brakes. There we go, like that. Now I'm going to switch it to anti-brake. You can see the motor is rolling on a lot more. It doesn't stop straight away. And by adjusting the amount of anti-brake that I've got, see, I can actually adjust it so the motor will run without pressing the trigger at all. Obviously, probably wouldn't do that so much when you were racing, but at least it gives you that level of adjustment. So how does this all work then? Well, here's the circuit here that we've just made with our anti-brake. So you can see this red wire here that's coming from the plug is this red wire running up the controller here. It comes all the way behind there and it joins to one end of the switch. So that is that contact there. The middle of the switch, which is these two contacts here, those are the ones that had the orangey reddy wire, and they join to the brake contacts, one brake contact on the wiper board and one brake contact here as the trigger returns. So those two brake contacts there are connected to the middle of the switch. Now the other side of the switch here has our fixed resistor, which is this resistor that runs along here. And that fixed resistor connects to one end of the potentiometer, which is this connection just here. Then we run through the potentiometer and we can jump out the potentiometer depending on where we adjust it. So you can see the other end of the potentiometer and the middle of the potentiometer. If I tilt it like this, so that end and the middle here, the end and the middle, those are connected to this black wire here. And this black wire was a wire that I looped behind, and it actually connects to the end of this resistor here on the very first band of the wiper board, the lowest band. So it connects right to the bottom here. And you can imagine you go through all these different resistors here, and in fact you get less and less and less and less resistance until you hit full power. So you can see that if I switch the switch into this scenario, where it's switched over to here, then the brake contacts on both the board and the trigger here, the brake contacts are connected directly to this big thick red wire which runs all the way down to this box here. And it comes in here and then runs through the variable brakes that I can either switch on or off, so I can have full brakes or variable brakes down here in the box. If I switch the switch to the middle position, then in effect the brake contacts here and here are connected to nothing. The red wire that goes down to the box is connected to nothing. So I have no brakes, I have no short circuit, I have just no brakes, zero brakes. But if I were to switch the switch to the third position, and this is the anti-brake position, the way I'm remembering it is if the switch points towards the anti-brake potentiometer, then you have anti-brakes. Then it connects these brake contacts through here to the end of the wiper board. So in effect, what we're getting is we're adding an extra wiper contact via our brake contacts on here. So the brake contacts become an even lower starting point on our wiper board. And we can adjust what that starting point is by adjusting our potentiometer. Now, why have I got this fixed resistor, and how did I work out what value this fixed resistor should be? Well, it all depends on what sort of cars you're driving. I know from previous experience and trying out my different motors that if I ran a 500 ohm potentiometer with somewhere between, as I say, 50 ohms and 100 ohm fixed resistor here, it works out well with the resistance of my wiper board and the kind of drive I need for my anti-brake. But it also depends on, as I say, the types of motor you're running. Maybe a good starting point would be to have a look at each value resistor you have in your wiper board. Now, in this case, they're about 18 ohms, 18 to 20 ohms, I think, on this wiper board here. I did measure it on a previous video. So if these are about 18 or 20 ohms, I would suggest that your fixed resistor is maybe 3-4 times bigger than one of your wiper board resistors here. Gives you a fairly good step for your anti-brake. If you went too small, as I say, you'll end up just driving your car off all the time and you won't actually have the ability for the car to stop. But again, if you go too big, then you won't have enough anti-brake. So your potentiometer of 500 ohms gives you a nice range of adjustment. But I say this resistor here, you do need something. I wouldn't actually just leave your potentiometer and set it to 0, because in effect then you're connecting the brake contact to the wiper contact here and there's no resistance in between. So it's almost like you're connecting it to the first band. You do want a gap here. So you do want a fixed resistor so that even when the potentiometer is set to 0, you do get some resistance between these two bands here. Now, those of you that followed the original circuit and know this circuit here, again, I'll put a little picture of it on the screen now up about here. You'll know that this wiper board here, the effective resistance of this wiper board is actually affected by the sensitivity adjustment of the controller. So if this wiper board is affected by the sensitivity, so will the anti-brakes. Now, that's actually quite a nice thing, because the more sensitive you need to have your controller for powering your motor in the first place, probably the more anti-brakes you would need. So it actually works quite nicely hand in hand, that by making it more sensitive, you get more anti-brake. By making it less sensitive, you get less anti-brake, because obviously the motor needs less drive to start with. So this simple circuit works really, really nicely. Now, as I said at the start of the video, this is by far the easiest way to add anti-brake to your controller, but there are other methods. Maybe you would like the car to brake, have anti-brake, but the anti-brake would decay away so that even if your car was still driven when you are on the brake band here, the car would eventually just slow down to nothing and there'll be no anti-brakes. In effect, it would go back to having 0 brakes. So that's a little bit more complicated circuit, and I'm going to save that one for a tech tip extra. The other thing you may want on your braking, which I've seen a feature on some pulse width modulation controllers, is the feature of the fact that when you brake, you will initially get full brakes for a very short period of time, and then the brakes will start to reduce. And then that gives you the ability for your car to roll a little bit more. So basically it will slow your car down really, really quickly to a set amount, and then the car will roll on. So there's some different ways of braking and different features that you could add into your braking circuit, and they all change the way the car feels on the track. Thank you for watching another CleaveTech tech tip, and I hope you really enjoyed seeing the effects that anti-brake can have on your car. We're nearly at the end of the controller series, but there is one more episode where I'm going to add one last feature to this controller, and I'm going to tidy up some wire and put it all back together again. So I'll see you again next week. Please subscribe, hit the C, so you don't miss any more of my CleaveTech tech tip videos or any more of my other videos such as model car videos and review videos, of which there'll be plenty more coming soon. Bye for now.